On the evening of October 15th, 1814, the autumn harvest ball at Montague House blazed with 1,000 candles, their golden light spilling through tall windows onto the garden paths below, where lanterns swayed gently in the crisp night air. Eleanor Fairfax stood in the shadow of a marble pillar, her borrowed silver mask doing little to shield her from the cruelty that drifted toward her on perfumed whispers. She had not meant to overhear, had merely sought a moment of quiet away from the crush of bodies in the ballroom, but Lady Sophia Crawford's voice carried with the precision of someone who wished to be heard. Such a waste of Lady Beatrice's generosity, keeping that plain creature about. 26 and not a single offer, not even from the desperate widowers. Those grey eyes of hers are positively unsettling, like a governess who has read too many books. Eleanor pressed her gloved hand against the cold stone, willing her expression to remain serene beneath the mask, willing her heart to accept what she had long known to be true. 3 years she had lived as her aunt's companion, 3 years of existing at the edges of ballrooms and dinner parties, invisible except when someone required an object of pity or ridicule. Her pale blue gown, a cast-off from her aunt's younger days, marked her as clearly as any sign might have proclaimed her circumstances. She was a vicar's daughter with no fortune, no beauty to speak of, and no prospects beyond the quiet gratitude expected of poor relations. The laughter that followed Lady Sophia's remarks faded as Eleanor slipped through the glass doors into the garden, desperate for air that did not taste of expensive perfume and casual cruelty. The full moon hung low and luminous above the ornamental hedges, casting silver light across paths she had walked 100 times in daylight, but which now seemed transformed into something from a fairy story. She found a bench beneath an ancient oak, its leaves turned to copper and gold, and sat with her hands folded in her lap, breathing slowly until the burning behind her eyes subsided. She would not cry. She had not cried in 3 years, not since her father's funeral when she had understood that her life as she had imagined it was over. The sound of footsteps on gravel made her stiffen, but before she could rise and retreat, a figure emerged from the shadows. A tall man in evening clothes, his face obscured by a black domino mask, an emerald pin glinting at his cravat. He stopped when he saw her, and for a moment neither spoke. "I beg your pardon," he said, his voice low and unexpectedly warm. "I did not realize this sanctuary was occupied." Eleanor found herself studying what she could see of his face, the strong line of his jaw, the suggestion of dark hair beneath his hat. "There is room enough," she heard herself say, surprised by her own boldness. "The moonlight belongs to no one." He tilted his head, something shifting in his posture that suggested amusement or, perhaps, interest. "A philosopher," he said, and took a seat at the far end of her bench. How refreshing. Everyone inside seems capable only of discussing the weather, and who is likely to marry whom. The bitterness in his tone matched something in her own heart, and despite herself, Eleanor smiled behind her mask. They talked for nearly 2 hours beneath that ancient oak, their words weaving through subjects that Eleanor had never dared discuss with anyone, the nature of happiness and whether it could be pursued or only stumbled upon, the weight of expectations carried by those born to certain stations, the solace to be found in books when human company proved wanting. He quoted poetry she recognized, and some she did not. And when she offered her own favorite verses in return, he leaned closer as though her words were precious things he wished to catch before they scattered on the autumn wind. She learned nothing of his identity, and offered nothing of her own, and in that strange freedom of anonymity, she discovered a version of herself she had thought long buried, a woman who could be witty and warm, who could make a handsome stranger laugh with an observation about the absurdity of society's rituals. The bells of the nearby church began to toll, their sound carrying across the gardens with solemn clarity, and Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest as she realized what the hour meant. "Midnight," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. "The unmasking." He rose when she did, and in the silver moonlight she saw him hesitate, his gloved hand reaching toward her as though he might take her fingers in his own. "These hours have been," he began, then stopped, shaking his head as though words had failed him for the first time that evening. They walked together toward the ballroom, where through the glass doors Eleanor could see the guests gathering in the center of the floor, their masked faces turned toward Lady Beatrice, who stood on the small dais with her hand raised for attention. "The moment has come," her aunt announced, her voice carrying that particular tone of theatrical pleasure she employed at her most triumphant moments. "Let us see whom we have been speaking with all evening, and discover what surprises the night has concealed." Eleanor's companion drew a breath beside her, and she felt rather than saw him turn toward her, as all around them hands rose to untie ribbons and remove elaborate disguises. She reached up to her own mask, her fingers trembling slightly, and pulled it away, just as he did the same. For one suspended heartbeat, she saw him clearly for the first time, the dark hair falling across a noble brow, the strong features that she had glimpsed in newspaper illustrations and heard described in countless drawing-room conversations, the face of Frederick Ashworth, heir to the Duke of Ravenscroft, the most eligible and most determinedly unmarried man in England. And she watched as recognition transformed his expression, as his gaze moved from her grey eyes to her outdated gown to the understanding of precisely who she was, the poor relation, the plain spinster, the object of Lady Sophia Crawford's ridicule. Something shuttered behind his eyes. A door closing that she had not even known was open, and when he stepped back from her, the distance felt like a chasm opening in the earth between them. "Miss Fairfax," he said, and his voice held none of the warmth that had colored their conversation in the garden. "I did not realize." He did not finish the sentence, but Eleanor heard what remained unspoken as clearly as if he had shouted it across the ballroom. She saw Lady Sophia's triumphant smirk from across the room, saw her aunt's sharp eyes taking in everything, and she gathered what remained of her dignity around her like armor. "Your Grace," she replied, and if her voice wavered, she would not allow herself to acknowledge it. "The pleasure was mine." She turned and walked away before he could see the devastation in her eyes, her spine straight, her head high, the silver mask clutched in fingers that had gone numb, leaving Frederick Ashworth standing alone in the candlelight, the emerald pin at his throat catching the light as he watched her go, something unreadable and almost anguished flickering across his features before he too turned away into the glittering, gossiping crowd. The morning of October 22nd, 1814 arrived wrapped in grey clouds that hung low over London, threatening rain that seemed to mirror the melancholy Eleanor had carried in her chest for 7 long days since the masquerade, 7 days during which she had buried herself in books and needlework and any task that might occupy her hands and quiet her treacherous mind, which insisted on returning again and again to those moonlit hours in the garden, to the warmth in a stranger's voice before he became the Duke of Ravenscroft, before his expression had closed like a door slammed shut against winter wind. She sat now in the morning room of her aunt's townhouse, a volume of poetry open in her lap, though she had read the same stanza 4 times without comprehending a single word, her grey eyes fixed unseeing on the rain beginning to streak the window panes while autumn leaves drifted past like fragments of forgotten promises. Lady Beatrice swept into the room with an energy that belied her 60 years, waving a cream-coloured envelope embossed with the Pembroke seal, and Eleanor felt her heart stutter in her chest even before her aunt spoke. "We have been invited to Lord Pembroke's house party at Pembroke Hall," her aunt announced, with satisfaction that seemed almost predatory. And Eleanor knew, before the next words came, what was about to shatter her fragile peace. "The Duke of Ravenscroft will be attending, naturally, as he and Pembroke were at Oxford together, and I have it on good authority that Lady Sophia Crawford has also secured an invitation, which means the entertainment shall be lively indeed." Eleanor's fingers tightened on the book of poetry, the verses within suddenly feeling like weapons that might be turned against her, reminders of conversations that had meant everything to her, and apparently nothing to him. "I cannot think why you would wish me to attend," she said carefully, pleased that her voice remained steady. Such gatherings are hardly suited to a companion of modest circumstances. Her aunt's eyes, sharp as ever despite her advancing years, fixed upon Eleanor with an expression that suggested she saw far more than Eleanor wished to reveal. "Nonsense," Lady Beatrice declared. "You shall attend because I require your company, and because hiding from the world has never improved anyone's situation." Across London, in the vast and echoing chambers of Ravenscroft House, Frederick Ashworth stood at his own window, watching the same grey morning, the same threatening rain, holding his own invitation to Pembroke Hall, while his younger brother Thomas lounged in a chair behind him with knowing amusement playing across his features. "You have read that letter 6 times, Thomas observed, "and each time your expression grows more tortured. Might I inquire whether Lord Pembroke has threatened you with something dire, or whether your distress has a more feminine origin?" Frederick did not turn from the window, but his jaw tightened as he thought of grey eyes that had haunted his dreams for 7 nights, eyes belonging to a woman society had taught him to overlook, a woman whose wit and warmth had made every glittering beauty he had ever met seem shallow and false by comparison. "Miss Fairfax will be attending," he said finally, and hated how her name felt like a confession on his lips. The carriage bearing Eleanor and Lady Beatrice arrived at Pembroke Hall precisely as the clock in the village church struck 4 on the afternoon of October 28, 1814, and Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat as the grand Palladian mansion came into view through the rain-spattered window, its pale stone facade stretching impossibly wide across manicured grounds where autumn had painted the trees in shades of amber and crimson that seemed almost too vivid against the grey and threatening sky. She smoothed the fabric of her brown travelling dress, practical and modest and entirely unsuitable for arriving at one of England's most celebrated country estates, and she reminded herself firmly that she had not come here to impress anyone, that she had come only because her aunt had insisted, and because refusing would have required explanations she was not prepared to give. The entrance hall swallowed them in marble and candlelight, as footmen materialized to take their wraps, and a dignified butler intoned their names, and Eleanor was acutely aware of the other guests already gathered in clusters throughout the vast space, their silks and jewels catching the light from the chandelier overhead, their eyes sliding toward the newcomers with the practiced assessment of those who knew precisely where everyone stood in the great hierarchy of society. She felt their gazes move past her almost immediately, dismissing her brown dress and plain features, and she told herself the familiar sting of invisibility was preferable to the alternative, preferable to being seen and found wanting as she had been at the masquerade. Then she looked across the entrance hall and found him standing near the great staircase, Frederick Ashworth, now fully the Duke of Ravenscroft since she had learned his father had taken a turn for the worse, and his dark eyes met hers with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. For one suspended moment neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed, and Eleanor saw something flicker in his expression that might have been recognition or regret or something else entirely, something that made her pulse quicken despite every warning she had given herself during the long journey from London. Then they both looked away, and the moment shattered like glass on stone. How delightful that Lady Beatrice has brought her companion, Lady Sophia Crawford's voice cut through the murmur of conversation with precision designed to carry, and Eleanor turned to find the blonde beauty regarding her travelling dress with an expression of exquisite disdain. I had not realized Pembroke Hall was accepting guests of such modest circumstances, but I suppose someone must look after the elderly. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, but kept her expression serene, drawing on years of practice in bearing such slights with dignity, and she did not see Frederick stiffen at Lady Sophia's words, did not see the muscle that tightened in his jaw or the way his hands curled at his sides before he deliberately relaxed them. A footman appeared to escort Eleanor to her room in the east wing, far from the grand apartments where guests of consequence were housed, and as she followed him up a servant's staircase and down a narrow corridor, she told herself. The small chamber overlooking the rose garden was perfectly adequate. Told herself the view of bare, thorny branches waiting for winter was fitting somehow. Told herself she had survived worse than a fortnight of proximity to a man who had looked at her as though she were nothing at all. The drawing-room had become unbearable by 10 o'clock on the evening of October 29th, the second day of the house party, with Lady Sophia holding court near the pianoforte, while other guests gathered around card tables, and Eleanor sat in a corner pretending to examine a book of botanical illustrations, while feeling the weight of every sidelong glance and whispered comment that seemed to follow her wherever she went in this grand house where she so clearly did not belong. She waited until her aunt became absorbed in a game of whist before slipping from the room with the volume of poetry she had brought from London tucked beneath her arm, her feet carrying her through corridors she had memorized during her afternoon explorations until she reached the library doors and pushed them open to find sanctuary in the two-story cathedral of books that had called to her since her arrival. The fire had been lit against the autumn chill, and rain had begun to tap against the tall windows as she stepped inside and breathed deeply of leather bindings and old paper and wood smoke, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease for the first time since the carriage had brought her to Pembroke Hall, and she was halfway to her chosen chair near the hearth when she realized she was not alone. Frederick Ashworth stood near the rolling ladder on the far wall, a book open in his hands, and his dark eyes lifted to meet hers with an expression that suggested he was as startled by her presence as she was by his. And for one terrible moment, Eleanor considered fleeing back to the drawing-room and Lady Sophia's barbed comments rather than face this man who had looked at her with such warmth in a moonlit garden and then with such cold distance when he learned her name. "Forgive me," she said, already turning toward the door. "I did not realize the room was occupied." "Miss Fairfax." His voice stopped her retreat, and she heard him set down his book and take a step toward her. "Please stay. You have as much right to seek refuge here as I do, and I find I have been wishing to speak with you." She turned back slowly, her fingers tightening on her poetry book, and she saw something in his face that she had not expected, something that looked almost like remorse. "I owe you an apology," he continued, moving closer until the firelight illuminated the sharp planes of his features and caught the gleam of his emerald cravat pin. "For my behavior at the masquerade, I was surprised, and I handled that surprise poorly, and I have regretted it every day since." Eleanor felt her heart beating too quickly as she searched his expression for mockery or pity, and found neither, only a sincerity that disarmed her careful defenses. "You owe me nothing, Your Grace," she replied quietly. "Society has taught us both where we stand." His jaw tightened at her words, and he gestured toward the chairs by the fire. "Will you sit with me a while?" he asked, "and tell me about the poetry book you are clutching as though it might save your life, because I believe I recognize that particular volume, and I should very much like to know if your favorite verse is the same as mine. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The morning of October 30th dawned grey and wet, rain still streaming down the tall windows of Pembroke Hall as Eleanor descended to breakfast with her aunt, and she told herself firmly that the flutter in her chest had nothing to do with the possibility of seeing Frederick Ashworth across the table. Nothing to do with the way he had quoted her favourite verse the night before, and watched her face as though her reaction mattered more than anything else in the world. He was already seated when she entered, and their eyes met for one brief moment before she looked away and took her place beside Lady Beatrice. But she felt his gaze follow her across the room, and she found herself sitting straighter than she had in years, her shoulders back, her chin lifted, as though his attention had reminded her that she possessed a spine worth displaying. The rain continued through the morning and confined the guests indoors, and Eleanor found herself in the music room, listening to Lady Sophia perform an Italian aria with technical perfection and no discernible feeling. And she was contemplating escape when Frederick appeared at her side and murmured that he had discovered a fascinating volume on Roman antiquities in the library that he thought might interest her. And before she quite knew how it happened, they were walking together through the corridor while Lady Sophia's voice faded behind them. They spent an hour examining maps and illustrations while rain hammered against the windows, and Eleanor forgot to guard her words, forgot to measure her enthusiasm, forgot everything except the pleasure of sharing ideas with someone who listened as though her thoughts deserved consideration. By afternoon, the rain had softened to mist, and several guests ventured onto the terrace for air, and Eleanor found Frederick beside her again, offering his arm as they walked along the balustrade, and she took it without thinking, and felt the warmth of him through layers of wool and linen as they discussed whether Wordsworth or Byron better captured the spirit of the age. "Have you noticed," Lady Sophia remarked loudly to her companion as they passed, "how the Duke seems to have developed a taste for charitable works?" And Eleanor felt Frederick's arm tense beneath her fingers. But when she glanced at his face, she saw only a cold contempt directed at Lady Sophia that made the blonde beauty falter and look away. The next morning brought weak autumn sunshine that painted the grounds in shades of amber and gold, and when Eleanor walked in the garden before breakfast, she was not surprised to find Frederick already there, waiting as though he had known she would come. And they walked together in companionable silence until he pointed out a squirrel attempting to hide an acorn in an already overstuffed hollow. And they both laughed, the sound startling in the quiet morning. And Eleanor realized with something like terror that she had not laughed like that in years, that this man she had believed cold and dismissive had somehow become the person who made her feel most alive. Lady Beatrice watched them from her window above with an expression of profound satisfaction, while Lady Sophia watched from hers with something far darker kindling in her calculating eyes. The morning of November 1st dawned, bright and deceptively mild for All Saints' Day, and when Lord Pembroke proposed a walking party to view the ruins of an old chapel on the far edge of his estate, Eleanor found herself agreeing despite her better judgment, drawn by the prospect of fresh air and the knowledge that Frederick had already accepted the invitation, his dark eyes meeting hers across the breakfast table with an expression that made her pulse quicken and her resolve to protect her heart crumble a little more with each passing hour. The party set out at 3 o'clock, a group of 12 guests picking their way along muddy paths through woods ablaze with the last fierce colours of autumn, and Eleanor walked near the back with her aunt, while Frederick strode ahead with their host, though she caught him glancing over his shoulder more than once as though to reassure himself she had not vanished. They had nearly reached the chapel ruins when the sky darkened with terrible swiftness and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, scattering the party as everyone sought shelter, and in the confusion of umbrellas and shouts and guests running in different directions, Eleanor found herself pulled away from the main group by a hand she recognized even before she saw his face, Frederick drawing her beneath the canopy of an ancient oak, and then, when the rain intensified to a torrent, leading her at a run toward a small stone cottage she had not noticed until they burst through its door and stood gasping in the dim interior while the storm raged outside. The groundskeeper's cottage was a single room with a cold hearth and dusty furniture and one blanket folded on a narrow bed, and Frederick immediately set about building a fire while Eleanor stood dripping near the door, her hair falling from its pins and her dress clinging to her in ways that made her cheeks burn with awareness of their isolation. "They should come looking for us soon," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, and Frederick looked up from the kindling with an expression that stole her breath, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, and water running down the sharp planes of his face. "Perhaps," he replied, "or perhaps the storm will keep them sheltered elsewhere for hours, and I find I cannot bring myself to regret the circumstance." He coaxed flames from the reluctant wood and insisted she take the blanket and the chair nearest the warmth, and as the afternoon darkened into evening and the rain showed no sign of relenting, they talked as they had never talked before, sharing secrets and sorrows and dreams long abandoned, and when Frederick spoke of his parents' bitter marriage and his terror of repeating their mistakes, Eleanor understood at last why he had built such walls around his heart. The firelight painted shadows across his face as he moved closer, and when he took her hands in his and whispered that she had changed everything he believed about himself, she felt tears prick her eyes, and when he leaned toward her with unmistakable intent, her lips parting in anticipation of a kiss. She wanted more than her next breath. The cottage door burst open to reveal Thomas Ashworth and 3 servants with lanterns, and the moment shattered like glass as Frederick pulled back and Eleanor looked away, but not before she saw in his eyes a promise that this was only the beginning. The evening of November 2nd arrived wrapped in crystalline cold, the first frost of the season painting delicate patterns across the windows of Pembroke Hall, as Eleanor dressed for dinner with trembling fingers and a heart that had not ceased its wild fluttering since the rescue party had found them in the cottage the night before. And when she descended to the drawing-room, she found Frederick waiting at the foot of the stairs with an expression so intent, so full of unspoken words, that she nearly stumbled on the final step. He caught her elbow and held it longer than propriety allowed, his dark eyes searching her face as though memorizing every feature. And when he murmured that he must speak with her privately after dinner, she could only nod, her voice stolen by the enormity of what she saw reflected in his gaze. The meal passed in a blur of courses she could not taste, and conversation she could not follow, and when the ladies withdrew, she felt his eyes follow her from the room like a physical touch against her spine. She had barely settled in the music room when a footman appeared with word that an express rider had arrived demanding to see his grace immediately, and through the open door she watched Frederick's face drain of color as he read the letter, watched him crumple the paper in his fist, and stride from the hall without a backward glance. An hour passed, then 2, and Eleanor made her excuses and retreated to her room, overlooking the sleeping rose garden, certain that whatever had called him away had ended everything before it could begin, and she was sitting at her window watching the stars emerge in the bitter, cold sky when a soft knock made her heart seize in her chest. Frederick stood in her doorway, his cravat loosened and his eyes wild with some terrible conflict, and when he stepped inside and closed the door behind him, she knew she should protest, should demand he leave, should protect what remained of her reputation and her heart, but instead she simply opened her arms and let him fall into them. He told her everything in broken whispers against her hair, his father dying in London and demanding Frederick return immediately to marry some earl's daughter he had never met, the old man's final act of control from his deathbed, and when Frederick said he should leave at once, but could not bear to go without telling her what she had become to him, Eleanor felt the last of her defenses crumble into dust. What passed between them in the hours that followed, she would remember always in fragments of sensation rather than coherent thought. The warmth of his hands, and the weight of his promises, and the way he whispered her name like a prayer against her skin while frost crept across the window and stars wheeled overhead in silent witness. She woke before dawn to find him gone, and a letter on her pillow, his emerald cravat pin weighing down the paper, and through tears that blurred the words she read his vow to return for her, to defy his father and claim her openly, to make her his duchess if she would have him, and she pressed the pin to her heart and believed every word because she had felt the truth of them in his touch. The first day passed in a haze of tender recollection, Eleanor drifting through the remaining hours of the house party with Frederick's letter pressed against her heart beneath her bodice, and his emerald pin hidden in her palm whenever she could manage it unseen, and when concerned guests inquired after the Duke's sudden departure, she murmured vague responses about family emergencies, while inside she glowed with the secret knowledge of his promises, his whispered vows, the way he had looked at her in the starlight, as though she were the answer to every question he had ever asked. The second day brought a faint unease she dismissed as natural anxiety, and the third day she began watching the road from her window with an intensity that made her aunt raise one eloquent eyebrow, and by the fourth day, when the house party dissolved and carriages bore guests away to their respective homes, Eleanor had convinced herself that word would arrive any moment, that Frederick was even now defying his dying father and racing back to claim her. But November crept forward in shades of grey and brown, the last leaves falling from skeletal trees as she sat in her aunt's London parlour, composing letters she never sent, and starting at every knock upon the door, and when a full week had passed with no word, she told herself that deathbed vigils were unpredictable things, that legal matters surrounding a dukedom must be enormously complex, that he would write as soon as he was able. The news reached them on November 12th through Lady Beatrice's network of society correspondence, delivered with the morning chocolate in tones of breathless gossip. The old Duke of Ravenscroft had died within hours of his son's arrival, and the new Duke had departed immediately for the continent to address some crisis with the family's Austrian estates, taking his brother Thomas with him, and leaving no word of when he might return. Eleanor heard the words as though from a great distance, her face carefully composed while something vital cracked and splintered inside her chest, and she excused herself with admirable calm before fleeing to her chamber, where she could finally allow herself to shake apart in private. She waited still, because she was foolish and the letter had been so sincere, and she had felt the truth of his feelings in every touch. But the days stretched into weeks, and November turned to grey December, and no word came. Not a letter, not a message through any mutual acquaintance, nothing but silence so complete it seemed designed to erase her very existence from his memory. Lady Sophia Crawford called one afternoon with poisonous sweetness to share the rumour circulating through the remnants of the London season, that the new Duke had been seen in Vienna with an Austrian countess, that negotiations for a brilliant match were already underway, and Eleanor smiled and nodded and showed nothing of the devastation consuming her from within. Only at night, alone in her cold bed with the emerald pin clutched so tightly it left marks upon her palm, did she allow herself to grieve for the future she had believed in for one brief shining moment, and she did not yet recognize the subtle changes in her body, the morning queasiness and bone-deep exhaustion, as anything more than the physical manifestation of a heart breaking slowly into dust. The morning of December 20th dawned grey and bitter, frost thick upon the windows of Lady Beatrice's London townhouse, and Eleanor woke as she had woken every morning for the past 3 weeks, with her stomach lurching violently and her head spinning as though the room had become a ship tossed upon stormy seas, and she barely made it to the basin before her body betrayed her once again in the most humiliating fashion. She had blamed the illness on grief at first, then on the winter cold that had settled into her bones and refused to leave, then on simple exhaustion from nights spent lying awake clutching an emerald pin and wondering how she could have been so catastrophically wrong about everything she thought she had felt in Frederick's arms. But as she knelt on the cold floor, with her forehead pressed against the porcelain rim and her hand trembling against her middle, a terrible suspicion began to crystallize in her mind with the slow inevitability of ice forming on a winter pond. She counted backwards with increasing desperation, her lips moving silently as she traced the weeks since that night in her room at Pembroke Hall. And when the mathematics resolved themselves into an answer she did not want to accept, she sat back on her heels and pressed both hands flat against her belly, as though she could somehow feel the truth through fabric and flesh and denial. Lady Beatrice found her there an hour later, still sitting on the cold floor in her nightgown, with her face the color of old parchment, and her grey eyes staring at nothing. And her aunt took one long look at her and sent immediately for Dr. Samuel Whitmore with instructions that he was to come through the back entrance and speak to no one of his visit. The examination was brief, and the verdict delivered with the gentle firmness of a man who had seen such situations before and understood the gravity of what his words would mean. And when Dr. Whitmore confirmed what Eleanor had already known in the deepest chambers of her heart, she felt something shift and settle within her like tectonic plates finding a new configuration after an earthquake. She waited for the shame to crush her, for the despair to swallow her whole, for the terror of her ruined reputation and impossible future to send her spiraling into hysterics as any proper young woman should. But instead she felt her spine straighten and her chin lift and her hands curve protectively over her still, flat stomach, with a fierceness that surprised her with its intensity. Lady Beatrice dismissed the doctor with promises of discretion and generous payment, then turned to her niece with an expression Eleanor had never seen on that sharp-featured face before, something that looked remarkably like respect, mingled with a sorrow that spoke of old wounds and paths not taken. And when her aunt said quietly that she had a small estate in Devon where no one would think to look for them, Eleanor felt the first tears she had shed since learning of Frederick's departure finally spill down her cheeks. Not tears of grief or shame, but tears of gratitude for this unexpected mercy in a world that had shown her precious little of it. The journey to Devon began on a morning so cold that frost flowers bloomed across the carriage windows, and Eleanor's breath hung in visible clouds as she settled against the worn velvet cushions, with one hand pressed instinctively to her still flat belly, and the other clutching the velvet box that held Frederick's emerald pin like a talisman against the uncertain future stretching before her. And Lady Beatrice sat opposite, with her sharp eyes softened by something Eleanor had never seen there before, a tenderness that spoke of secrets kept and choices made long ago that her aunt had never shared with anyone. The countryside rolled past in shades of winter brown and grey, bare trees standing like sentinels along roads that grew progressively narrower and more rutted as they travelled further from London and everything Eleanor had known. And when they finally arrived at Fairhaven after 3 days of travel, she stood before the modest stone house with its climbing roses dormant against weathered walls and felt something loosen in her chest, a release of tension she had not realized she was carrying. The months that followed took on a rhythm of quiet preparation and gradual transformation, her body changing in ways that both frightened and amazed her, as winter softened into spring and Dr. Whitmore made his monthly visits from the nearby village with increasing frequency and deepening concern in his kind eyes, until the March morning when he pressed his instrument to her swelling belly and listened with an expression that made Eleanor's heart stop before he looked up with wonder rather than worry, and told her that he heard not 1 heartbeat, but 3. She wept then, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief or joy. And Mrs. Martha Chambers, the housekeeper Lady Beatrice had hired for her fierce loyalty and complete discretion, held Eleanor through the storm while her aunt stood at the window with tears tracking silently down her weathered cheeks. Far away in Vienna, Frederick Ashworth paced the floors of a rented apartment and wrote letters that never arrived and received reports that twisted truth into unrecognizable shapes, including the devastating intelligence from a hired investigator that Miss Eleanor Fairfax had married a country gentleman in December and was now beyond his reach forever, information planted by enemies he did not yet know he had. And he drank himself into oblivion for 3 days before Thomas pulled him back from the edge and convinced him that returning to England would only cause scandal for a woman who had clearly moved on with her life. The birth came on June 18th, 1815, the same day that Wellington faced Napoleon at Waterloo, and Eleanor labored through 18 hours of agony with Mrs. Chambers bathing her forehead and Dr. Whitmore's steady hands guiding 3 perfect infants into the world one after another as dawn broke golden through the windows. And when Eleanor held her children for the first time, 2 boys and 1 girl, with their father's dark hair already visible in silky tufts and her own grey eyes blinking up at her with newborn solemnity, she understood that everything she had survived had been leading to this moment, this fierce and terrible love that rewrote every definition she had ever held of strength and purpose and home. She named them Henry for the king, Charlotte for the princess, and William for her father, and she whispered promises against their downy heads that they would never doubt their worth, never question whether they were wanted, never know the particular cruelty of being overlooked by a world too blind to see their value. The years folded into one another like pages of a well-worn book, each season bringing its own particular joys and sorrows. As Eleanor watched her children grow from helpless infants into small people with distinct souls and temperaments that never failed to astonish her with their complexity. Henry, the firstborn by mere minutes, developed a serious disposition that reminded Eleanor painfully of Frederick in his more contemplative moments, his grey eyes watching the world with an intensity that seemed far too old for his small face, and he would sit for hours examining beetles in the garden or demanding that his mother read the same passage about knights and dragons until she knew it by heart. Charlotte emerged as the wild one, all tangled dark curls and skinned knees and infectious laughter that rang through the halls of Fairhaven like bells, her spirit so fierce and ungovernable that Mrs. Chambers declared weakly that the child would either become a great leader or burn the house down, possibly both. William, the youngest and gentlest, possessed a sweetness that made Eleanor's heart ache with tenderness, his small hand always reaching for hers during thunderstorms, his tears flowing freely for injured, birds and wilted flowers, his grey eyes holding depths of empathy that she recognized as her own inheritance, passed down through blood and bone. The village came to know her as Mrs. Fairfax, the young widow who had retreated to the country with her aunt, and then remained after Lady Beatrice's death in the second winter, a death that had struck Eleanor with unexpected force, given their complicated history. But her aunt had left her everything, including Fairhaven and a modest income that allowed her to raise her children with dignity, if not luxury. She learned to manage accounts and negotiate with tradesmen and make decisions that would have terrified the timid companion she had once been in, and somewhere in the endless cycle of fevers nursed and nightmares soothed and small victories celebrated, she discovered that she had become someone entirely new, someone who could stand alone against the world if necessary. The loneliness came mostly at night after the children were asleep and the house grew quiet around her, and she would sometimes take out the velvet box containing Frederick's emerald pin and wonder if he had ever thought of her at all, or if that single night had meant nothing beyond a momentary pleasure quickly forgotten. She had told the children that their father was a good man who had loved them very much but had been called away before they were born. And when Charlotte asked if he would ever return, Eleanor had simply said that some questions had no answers yet. In London, in a study filled with maps and investigator reports and 3 years' worth of desperate correspondence, Frederick Ashworth, Duke of Ravenscroft, finally received the letter that would change everything. A confession from a dying servant who had been paid to intercept communications and spread false information. And as he read the words that revealed Eleanor had never married, had borne his children alone, had vanished into the countryside believing herself abandoned, he felt his world crack open with equal parts hope and horror. The return. Temporal anchor. June 25th, 1818, 3 years and 7 months after their night. Late afternoon, 5 p.m. Summer, children's 3rd birthday approaching. Character state tracking. Eleanor, content in her independence, no longer waiting, will be shocked, then angry, then conflicted. Frederick, desperate, remorseful, terrified she will reject him. Has searched for 6 months, relationship status about to collide after years apart. Plot dependencies. Reunion must be dramatically satisfying. Eleanor's strength must be evident. Frederick must see children for first time. Sets up conflict. Can trust be rebuilt? Scene goals. Frederick arrives at Fairhaven unannounced, Eleanor's shock at seeing him. Children present, Frederick overwhelmed seeing them. Eleanor's anger surfaces. "You left us!" Frederick's explanation begun but interrupted. Children's innocent questions. Physical intimacy. None. Distance maintained. Continuity markers. Summer evening. Golden light. Children playing in garden when Frederick arrives. Eleanor in simple muslin dress, hair loosely pinned. Frederick travel-worn, thinner, haunted-looking. Mrs. Chambers protective and suspicious. Emerald pin visible on Eleanor's dress. She wears it daily now. The afternoon sun hung golden and heavy over Fairhaven's garden, where Eleanor sat on the worn wooden bench, watching her children chase butterflies through the lavender. Charlotte's shrieks of laughter mingling with Henry's patient instructions to William about the proper technique for catching them without causing harm. And she had just closed her eyes to savor this moment of perfect contentment when the sound of hooves on the lane made her look up with mild curiosity that transformed into something else entirely. As a rider appeared at the gate, a tall figure on a lathered horse whose face she would have known anywhere, despite the gauntness that had sharpened his features and the shadows that had deepened beneath his eyes. And for a long moment, neither of them moved, while the world contracted to this impossible reality of Frederick Ashworth dismounting in her garden after 3 years and 7 months of silence. She rose slowly, her hand moving instinctively to the emerald pin at her throat, where it had rested every day since the children learned to ask about their father. And she watched him take in the scene before him, with an expression that shifted from desperate hope to wonder to something that looked very much like his heart breaking, as his gaze found the 3 small figures who had stopped their play to stare at the stranger with identical grey eyes in faces framed by dark curls. "Mamma," Charlotte called out with her characteristic boldness. "Who is that man, and why is he crying?" And Eleanor heard Frederick make a sound that was not quite a word as he gripped the gate for support, his knuckles white against the weathered wood. And Mrs. Chambers appeared in the doorway with her arms crossed, and her expression promising violence if this visitor proved unwelcome. "You left us," Eleanor said, and her voice emerged steadier than she had any right to expect, given that her knees had turned to water and her pulse was roaring in her ears. "You left, and you never sent word. And I waited Frederick. I waited until waiting became another form of dying, and I had to choose to live instead." He stepped forward with one hand extended, as if approaching a wild creature that might bolt at any sudden movement, and the words that poured from him came broken and desperate, stories of intercepted letters and planted lies and a dying servant's confession that had sent him searching across England for 6 months until Thomas finally traced her to this village. Henry had moved to stand before his mother, with his small shoulders squared in unconscious imitation of the protective stance Eleanor herself had adopted, and Frederick knelt in the grass to bring himself to his son's eye level, his voice cracking as he said, "I am so sorry I was not here." And Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest that she had thought permanently sealed, though whether it was hope or fury or grief she could not yet tell. The evening stretched long and difficult, as Eleanor sent the children inside with Mrs. Chambers, despite Charlotte's protests and William's tears, and she stood facing Frederick across the garden path with the lavender swaying between them and 3 years of silence pressing down like a physical weight. And when he tried to step closer, she held up her hand in a gesture that stopped him as effectively as any wall. She listened as he spoke, his words tumbling out in a desperate flood about his father's death the very night he arrived in London, and the chaos of inheritance, and the forged letters that had told him she had married a country squire and wanted nothing more to do with him, about the servant who had been bribed by forces he still did not fully understand, to ensure that no communication reached either of them, about the 6 months he had spent searching every corner of England, once Thomas had finally discovered the truth from a deathbed confession. His voice broke when he described receiving reports that she had borne children alone, that she had faced society's condemnation without him, that she had built a life from the ruins he had unknowingly left behind, and Eleanor watched his face contort with a grief so genuine that she felt her carefully constructed defenses begin to crack, despite every instinct screaming at her to protect herself. But grief was not enough, she told him, her voice steady even as her heart raced, because she had spent 3 years believing he had simply tired of her after one night, 3 years answering her children's questions about why their father never came, 3 years building walls around her heart so thick she had almost forgotten what it felt like to hope. Frederick dropped to his knees in the grass without any of the calculated grace she remembered from ballrooms and drawing rooms, and the Duke of Ravenscroft knelt before her like a penitent before a saint, his hands open and empty and trembling. He told her he would spend the rest of his life earning her forgiveness if she would permit it, that he wanted nothing more than to be a father to the children he had never known, and a husband to the woman he had never stopped loving. That he understood if she could never trust him again, but he would wait as long as necessary for even the smallest chance. The word husband hung in the air between them as the sun sank lower and painted the garden in shades of gold and rose. And Eleanor thought of all the nights she had lain awake wondering if she had ever meant anything to him at all, of all the mornings she had risen to face another day of raising 3 children alone, of the woman she had become through fire and loss, and the fierce determination to give her children a life worth living. She did not say yes, but she did not say no, and when she finally spoke, it was to tell him that he could return tomorrow to meet his children properly. That trust once broken could not be mended with pretty words and dramatic gestures, but only with time and consistency and proof, and the hope that blazed in his eyes as he rose was almost painful to witness. The days that followed Frederick's return unfolded with a careful choreography that Eleanor orchestrated with the same quiet determination she had applied to every challenge of the past 3 years, allowing him to visit each afternoon at precisely 2 o'clock when the children had woken from their rest and were most amenable to company. And she watched from the doorway as this man who commanded estates and influenced parliaments sat cross-legged in the grass, while Charlotte decorated his hair with daisy chains, and Henry solemnly explained the proper care of the garden snails he had collected in a wooden box, and William simply climbed into his lap and fell asleep against his chest with the trusting abandon of a child who had never learned to fear abandonment. She saw how Frederick's hands trembled when he held them, how his eyes grew bright when Charlotte called him Papa for the first time, with the casual ownership children bestow so easily, how he looked at Eleanor across the garden with an expression that held equal measures of gratitude and grief, and something that might have been the beginning of healing. Mrs. Chambers maintained her suspicious vigilance, serving tea with pointed silence and positioning herself within earshot of every conversation, but even she began to soften when Frederick arrived one afternoon with a wooden rocking horse he had commissioned from the village carpenter, and assembled himself with hands more accustomed to holding reins than tools. The villagers whispered, of course, as villagers always did, but the story Frederick allowed Thomas to spread was close enough to truth that it held together under scrutiny. A secret marriage, a tragic separation caused by family interference, a husband finally reunited with the wife and children he had spent years seeking. Eleanor neither confirmed nor denied these tales, focusing instead on the children's happiness and her own slow journey towards something that was not quite forgiveness, but was perhaps its necessary predecessor. She found herself telling Frederick about the years he had missed, the words flowing more easily as the days passed, describing Charlotte's first steps at 11 months and the way Henry had taught himself to read at barely 3, and William's nightmares that only ceased when she sang the lullaby her own mother had sung to her, and she watched Frederick's face as he absorbed each detail with the desperate attention of a man trying to memorize a text he feared might be taken from him. By the end of the second week, she could no longer pretend that her anger was the impenetrable fortress she had believed it to be, because the truth was more complicated than the simple narrative of abandonment she had constructed to survive, and the man kneeling in her garden teaching his son to identify birdsong was not the villain she had needed him to be, but simply a flawed human being who had been caught in circumstances as cruel as her own. The third week of Frederick's visits brought with it a shift that Eleanor felt in her very bones, a settling of something that had been unsettled for so long she had forgotten what stillness felt like. And it was on a Thursday afternoon, when the summer sun hung golden and heavy over Fairhaven, that she found herself sitting beside him on the old stone bench beneath the apple tree, while the children napped inside, and Mrs. Chambers pointedly polished silver within view of the window. Frederick spoke of his parents then, words she had never heard from him in all their brief and blazing acquaintance, telling her of his mother's tears shed in private rooms and his father's cold indifference, and the vow he had made as a boy of 12 never to trap any woman in such a prison of obligation and resentment. And Eleanor understood at last why he had built such formidable walls around his heart, and why the prospect of an arranged marriage had sent him fleeing from her that November morning with only a letter and a promise he had been unable to keep. She told him in turn of her own fears, of the terror that had gripped her when Dr. Whitmore had confirmed the pregnancy, and the greater terror that had followed when she realized she would face it alone, of the nights she had lain awake, wondering if she had the strength to raise even one child, let alone 3, of the moment when Charlotte had first opened her grey eyes and looked at her with such perfect trust that Eleanor had known she would move mountains and cross oceans and defy every convention of the society that had dismissed her if it meant protecting these tiny, fierce lives she had brought into the world. Frederick wept then, silently and without shame, and Eleanor watched the tears track down his face with something that felt dangerously like tenderness stirring beneath her breastbone. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the emerald cravat pin, the very twin of the one she had kept in its velvet box for 3 years, and he told her he had worn its mate every day since leaving her, that it had been his talisman through endless months of legal battles and fruitless searches and the growing certainty that he had lost her forever. Eleanor rose from the bench and walked into the house without speaking, returning moments later with the velvet box open in her palm. And when she placed the two pins side by side, they caught the afternoon light like twin stars fallen to earth. She did not say she forgave him, because forgiveness was not something that could be spoken into existence like a magic spell, but she did say that she was beginning to believe him, that the man who wept for lost years and played with snails and learned to braid Charlotte's hair with clumsy, devoted fingers was perhaps not the same man who had left her alone in a cold November dawn, and the hope that bloomed across Frederick's face was so raw and vulnerable that Eleanor felt her carefully maintained distance begin to crumble like autumn leaves in a winter wind. The proposal came on a morning in late July when the summer had reached its fullest ripeness, and the garden at Fairhaven blazed with roses in every shade from palest blush to deepest crimson, and Eleanor found Frederick waiting for her beneath the apple tree, with an expression so solemn that her heart contracted with sudden fear that he had come to tell her he was leaving. The children were with Mrs. Chambers gathering strawberries in the kitchen garden, their high, clear voices carrying on the warm breeze, and Eleanor approached slowly with her hands clasped before her in the manner she had adopted years ago to hide their trembling. Frederick stood as she drew near, and she saw that he held something in his hands, a small box of worn leather that bore the unmistakable patina of age and careful keeping. And when he opened it, the morning light caught the ring within and scattered it into 1,000 points of fire. It had belonged to his grandmother, he told her, the only person in his family who had married for love, and he had carried it with him through every day of their separation, because he had never stopped believing that one day he would place it on her finger. Eleanor looked at the ring with its circle of diamonds surrounding a single grey pearl that matched her eyes so perfectly it seemed impossible it had not been chosen for her, and she felt the last of her resistance crumbling like the walls of a besieged city that has held out long past hope. Frederick knelt then, this duke who commanded the respect of princes and the envy of lesser men, knelt in the grass with dew staining his immaculate breeches, and took her work, roughened hands in his own, and asked her to be his wife, with a voice that broke on the final word. She did not answer immediately because the moment deserved more than a hasty response, and she thought of all the years she had spent believing herself unworthy of love, all the cruel whispers she had overheard at that long-ago masquerade, all the nights she had lain alone with her hand pressed against the swell of her belly, wondering if she would ever feel whole again. She thought of her children, their dark curls and grey eyes, their fierce loyalty to each other and to her, and she knew that whatever answer she gave would shape their lives as surely as it would shape her own. The word yes rose from somewhere deeper than thought, from the place where she had hidden her heart for safekeeping during all those years of struggle and solitude. And when she spoke it aloud, Frederick's face transformed with a joy so pure and unguarded that Eleanor felt tears spilling down her cheeks even as she smiled. He rose and gathered her into his arms with a tenderness that made her bones ache with longing for all the embraces they had missed, and somewhere in the distance she heard Charlotte's triumphant shriek as the child spotted them through the garden gate and began running toward them with her brothers close behind, their small feet thundering across the lawn like a cavalry charge of love descending upon this moment that would bind them all together as the family they were always meant to be. The wedding took place on a golden morning in late August, when the summer heat had mellowed into something softer, and the gardens of Fairhaven blazed with the last triumphant roses of the season, and Eleanor stood before the small stone church in the village, where she had worshipped for 3 years with her children, pressed close against her skirts, and her heart beating so fiercely she feared it might escape her chest entirely. Frederick had wanted a grand ceremony in London, a declaration before all of society that would silence every whisper and crush every doubt. But Eleanor had asked for this instead. This quiet country wedding among the people who had accepted her without question during her years of exile, and he had agreed without hesitation because he was learning that her wishes mattered more to him than any display of ducal power. The villagers filled the pews with curious and approving faces, farmers and shopkeepers and the elderly widow who had taught Eleanor to make jam, and the young mother whose difficult birth Dr. Whitmore had attended with Eleanor assisting. And Mrs. Chambers sat in the front row, weeping into a handkerchief, while simultaneously keeping one sharp eye on the children who squirmed with excitement beside her. Thomas Ashworth stood as witness for his brother, his face wreathed in a smile that had not dimmed since he learned of the engagement, and he had already declared himself the most devoted uncle in all of England, and promised each child a pony of their very own. Eleanor wore a gown of pale silver silk that caught the light streaming through the ancient windows and transformed her into something luminous, and around her throat hung a delicate chain bearing 2 emerald pins that Frederick had commissioned to be joined into a single pendant, a symbol of promises kept and hearts reunited. The vicar spoke the ancient words, and Eleanor responded in a voice that did not waver. And when Frederick slipped his grandmother's ring onto her finger, she felt something shift in the universe itself, some cosmic ledger being balanced after years of painful imbalance. He kissed her then, with a tenderness that made the congregation sigh collectively, and when they turned to face the assembled witnesses as husband and wife, the first sound Eleanor heard was Charlotte's imperious voice demanding to know if Papa would live with them forever now. The laughter that followed was warm and genuine, and Frederick knelt to gather all 3 children into his arms at once, a feat that required considerable ducal determination, and he promised them solemnly that he would never leave again, that they were his family now and forever, and that nothing in heaven or earth could separate them. Eleanor watched this tableau with tears streaming freely down her face, making no attempt to hide them, and she thought of all the years she had believed herself unworthy of love, all the nights she had lain alone wondering if she would ever feel whole. And she marveled at the strange and winding path that had brought her from that long-ago masquerade to this moment of perfect belonging. The congregation spilled out into the sunshine for the wedding breakfast laid on the lawn of Fairhaven, and Eleanor Fairfax, who was now Eleanor Ashworth, Duchess of Ravenscroft, stood in the garden she had tended through years of solitary determination, and felt the warmth of her husband's hand in hers, and knew that every moment of struggle had been worth this single shining instant of joy. The months that followed their wedding unfolded like pages from a book Eleanor had never dared to imagine herself worthy of reading, and she discovered that happiness was not a single blinding moment, but rather an accumulation of small and precious instants that built upon each other until they formed something solid enough to stand upon. Frederick proved himself a father with the same fierce dedication he had once applied to avoiding attachment, rising before dawn to walk the grounds with Henry perched upon his shoulders, spending hours in the nursery listening to Charlotte's elaborate stories about imaginary kingdoms where she reigned as benevolent queen, sitting quietly with William while the gentle boy drew pictures of flowers and butterflies with the colored pencils his father had ordered from London. The household at Fairhaven transformed around them, expanding to accommodate a duke's requirements while somehow maintaining the warmth Eleanor had cultivated during her years of solitary stewardship, and Mrs. Chambers presided over this evolution with the satisfaction of a general whose campaign has exceeded all expectations. Letters arrived daily from London, from the stewards of Frederick's various estates, from solicitors and men of business and distant relations who had suddenly remembered their connection to the Duke of Ravenscroft, now that he had emerged from his continental exile with a wife and 3 legitimate heirs, and Frederick dealt with each communication with an efficiency that left his afternoons free for the family he had missed for so long. Society's response to their marriage proved exactly as tumultuous as Eleanor had anticipated, and Frederick had hoped, with Lady Sophia Crawford leading a faction that whispered of scandal and impropriety, while a larger contingent found the story impossibly romantic and championed the new Duchess as a heroine from a novel. Thomas Ashworth arrived for an extended visit in September and proved himself the most devoted uncle imaginable, teaching Henry to fish in the stream that bordered the estate and allowing Charlotte to practice her imperious commands upon him with an indulgence that made Eleanor laugh until her sides ached. The autumn deepened around them with its familiar progression of golden leaves and crisp mornings, and evenings spent before the fire with the children sprawled across the carpet and Frederick's hand warm in Eleanor's own, and she sometimes caught herself holding her breath as though afraid that exhaling might shatter the dream she had somehow wandered into. Frederick noticed these moments of fearful stillness and addressed them with patient tenderness, reminding her again and again through word and deed that he was not leaving, that she was not dreaming, that the life they were building together was as real and permanent as the ancient stones of Fairhaven itself. On the night of their 3-month anniversary, he presented her with a portrait he had secretly commissioned, showing Eleanor seated in the garden with all 3 children clustered around her, and she wept when she saw how the artist had captured not the plain features society had always dismissed, but the luminous quality that Frederick insisted he had recognized from their very first conversation in that moonlit garden 4 years before. The emerald pendant at her throat caught the candlelight as she embraced him. 2 promises made 1. And Eleanor understood finally that she had not merely survived her years of struggle, but had been forged by them into someone capable of accepting love without fear. The years that followed wove themselves into a tapestry of such richness that Eleanor sometimes paused in the midst of ordinary moments to marvel at the life she had somehow been granted. And on a particular afternoon in the autumn of 1823, 5 years after their wedding and 9 years after that fateful masquerade where everything had begun, she sat in the garden of Ravenscroft Hall, watching her children race across the manicured lawn with their father in enthusiastic pursuit, and felt her heart swell with a gratitude so profound it bordered on pain. Henry, at 8 years old, had grown into a serious and thoughtful boy, who reminded Eleanor of Frederick in his more contemplative moods, already showing an aptitude for mathematics and a quiet authority that made his siblings instinctively defer to his judgment in matters of importance. Charlotte had fulfilled every promise of her spirited infancy and ruled the nursery with benevolent tyranny, her imagination boundless and her determination to have her own way tempered only slightly by the gentle guidance of parents who recognized their own stubbornness reflected in her flashing grey eyes. William remained the dreamer of the 3, his artistic talents now formally encouraged by a drawing master who declared him genuinely gifted, and he spent hours capturing the beauty he observed in the world around him with a sensitivity that moved Eleanor to tears when she examined his sketchbooks. The family divided their time between Fairhaven in Devon, where Eleanor had built her sanctuary during the years of separation, and Ravenscroft Hall in Yorkshire, where generations of Ashworths had presided over vast estates, and in both places the children thrived with the particular confidence of young people who have never doubted they are loved. Society had long since accepted the Duchess of Ravenscroft. The initial scandal of her irregular courtship fading into romantic legend, retold at dinner parties by hostesses who had once whispered behind their fans about the plain vicar's daughter who had somehow captured the most elusive duke in England. Lady Sophia Crawford had married a minor baron and relocated to Scotland, where her opportunities for spreading London gossip were mercifully limited, and Eleanor found she could think of her former tormentor with something approaching pity for a woman whose life seemed built entirely on the diminishment of others. Thomas Ashworth had married a cheerful young woman named Miss Lucy Pemberton and produced 2 children of his own who regarded their Ravenscroft cousins with the particular devotion of younger siblings, and family gatherings now filled the great halls with laughter and chaos and the kind of noise that Frederick declared he had never imagined wanting, and now could not imagine living without. On this golden autumn afternoon, Eleanor watched her husband finally catch Charlotte and swing her shrieking with delight into the air, while the boys collapsed in breathless heaps on the grass, and she placed one hand on the gentle swell of her belly, where a 4th child grew in secret, not yet announced to anyone except Frederick, who had wept when she told him and promised that this time he would be present for every moment. The emerald pendant at her throat caught the slanting sunlight as she rose to join her family on the lawn, and Eleanor Ashworth, Duchess of Ravenscroft, walked forward into the golden light of an afternoon that seemed to promise endless tomorrows, carrying within her the profound and humbling knowledge that the overlooked vicar's daughter had somehow found her way to a happiness beyond anything she had ever dared to dream.